There are new calls saying that Conn Smythe was racist, and therefore the name of the Conn Smythe Trophy should be changed. Should it? Let's dive down that rabbit hole. We're missing a fourth today. Rick Zamperin taking the day off. He'll be back. Don't worry about it. But we have Bubba O'Neill. We have Steve Milton from The Spectator. And we have a question that is getting some traction, these days. And that is, should Conn Smythe's name be taken off the Conn Smythe Trophy out of concerns, out of claims that Conn Smythe was a racist who kept Herb Carnegie out of the NHL? Bubba? We'll start with you. What's the answer?
Well, I think it's important to frame one thing before we go any further, is that being a racist and being prejudiced are two different things. I think it's important to establish that right away. At no point have I ever believed that Conn Smythe, never known the man, never met the man, well beyond my time. I could not say to you, in all honesty, that the man was a racist. But there were decisions that were made, in my opinion, that would obviously show prejudice. And you have a player that of Herb Carnegie's abilities. That you actually have, words that were said by Red Story, who was a longtime broadcaster like all of us, a referee as well, that said that, I would give $10,000 to turn that man white. And, I'd take him tomorrow if you could turn him white. So those are words to me that echo a certain amount of prejudice that you would not, as a leader of the Maple Leafs, take a chance on this man. Now, even if, in my opinion, he wasn't racist or didn't make a prejudiced decision, to me that perpetrates racism and perpetrates a stereotype of a certain type of player that he's not good enough for us. We would basically have to whiteface him to get in the league, because he obviously had the ability. You're talking about a 3-time MVP, and I guess in the Quebec League, which I guess, hockey was set up so differently at the time than what it is now. The next step was for him in, I believe, 1938, 1940. This was done by the Leafs. And then again, and 10 years later, the New York Rangers finally did offer him a contract, but they lowballed him to the point that he couldn't leave his semi-professional team to go play with perhaps an NHL team where they were going to assign him immediately to the minors. Makes no sense.
Steve?
One of the problems here is that the documentation isn't as strong as it is for some of the situations we're having in the United States with the tearing down of the monuments and those kinds of things. But this is a time of action. It is a time for us to look not just cursorily, but in depth at things. And there was a lot of talk. I grew up in Toronto, and I was telling Scott off air here, Bubba, that I played for Herb Carnegie for 4 years. Knew him and saw him again after about 50 years, just before he died, and a couple of times. And he was a legend at the time. My father first told me about that. It was the first thing I ever heard about racism when I was about 9 years old when I started to play for Herb. He mentioned that. And of course, I don't know if my dad only knew it as rumors or what, but he mentioned the $10,000 thing for turning somebody white, that kind of thing. There were also a lot of talk in Toronto at the time about Conn Smythe, and not just black players, but Jewish and Italian as well. There were a lot of talk about that at the time, but again, a lot of it was rumors at different times, right? A lot of stuff isn't documented. You don't have somebody saying something directly on the record. There's even some debate about the verity of that quote. But I would say, and I would agree with Bubba there, that it's a sign of sort of the times. And maybe you don't do it as an attack on Conn Smythe, but as an attack on what was clearly systemic racism. Now, there weren't a lot of black players around, but this one was good. I mean, they bought a whole league to get, the Montreal Canadiens bought a whole league so they could turn professional, so then they could make Jean Beliveau a Canadian. That was the only way they could do it. Herb Carnegie was the best player on that team. He was a little older than Beliveau, but he was the best player on that team. I think he was a little older than Beliveau. So, yeah, I would say yes. And I have other reasons for that too, and it has a lot to do with me being kind of a union guy and all that kind of thing, and the way that Conn Smythe systemically was part of the system that tried to destroy the union, but also the way the gardens were built and the way those shares were bought back. There's some question about all of that. So I would say, yeah, let's look at it real closely, and I think the end result should be, let's rename the thing, but let's rename it in not as much as a personal attack on Conn Smythe, but what he stood for is what Bubba is saying there, the era.
The problem is, I don't know if you can possibly rename a trophy or do these kind of things without it being an attack on the person. If it's after a person, the implication is if you change the name, that person was horrible and deserves to now have it taken away. And, I looked into this yesterday because I'd heard the quote before. And this, to be clear, I would say 95% of the talk in the last few days about this Conn Smythe thing has been based on this quote, that if you could find a way to, I'd give you $10,000 to turn Herb Carnegie white or something to that effect. The problem is that there's a guy who wrote a book. His name was Cecil Harris, and he wrote a book, Breaking the Ice, The Black Experience in Professional Hockey. And he wrote extensively about this and says there's now all kinds of doubt about whether that statement was ever said by Conn Smythe. And so my concern with this is not defending racism somehow. It's if you're going to take the name off the trophy, you are essentially saying this was a bad guy who said bad things. And if we don't know he said those bad things, that is, to me, a frightening thing, that we're now taking rumors of bad behavior and saying, well, even rumors are enough now to have you have your name taken off or to tell people that you were not the guy that everyone thought you were. And,
but Scott, it has appeared to me that Herb Carnegie is a very honorable man, a man of 13 Hall of Fames, minus the National Hockey League, which makes the Hockey Hall of Fame, which again blows me away because it's not the National Hockey League Hall of Fame, it's the Hockey Hall of Fame, and all he has done in his career. Order of Canada, is there a higher honor in this country? And there are too many people within that. And I could think of Jean Beliveau, again, Steve brought his name up, probably the most honorable player on and off the ice in the history of the Montreal Canadiens. He has laid claim to that statement being either said or the action was taken. And again, actions speak a lot louder than words. You had a man that was watching him. This is well documented that he was watching him play on several occasions. So obviously there was an enamoration for this player himself, but he did not have the guts or did not make the action to do so, to bring him in there maybe 20 years earlier than Willie O'Ree was brought in. You have Frank Mahovlich, who actually talked about the entire line because there was a black line that this team, that he was playing with two other black players, and said that this black line was the best line of hockey at that level that he had ever seen. So you're right in saying that, there's some questions about documentation. There's questions about documentation of all periods in almost every subject going way back to 1938. But there are too many people that will stand up for Herb Carnegie, and Herb Carnegie himself saying how much he was hurt because I'm sure it somehow got back to him. So because we don't have it physically documented on a newspaper, I don't think that's good enough, Scott.
My argument, Bob, is about this. So, okay, Steve, go ahead.
But no, I was going to say it's a good point that you are making. You got to watch rumor and innuendo. But I think there's got to be some kind of deep study here on this and some action. And really, there's some other things in the NHL too. The Norris Trophy. I mean, if you look into the history of Norris himself, that's pretty there's a lot of implications of gangsterisms and all of this kind of thing there. The NHL in that era was a little bit on the funny side, I would say. And I agree that I think you got to watch it. That rumors don't take somebody down. And let's not forget all the fabulous things that Conn Smythe did, particularly the Conn Smythe dinner and for what was then called Crippled Children and the Easter Seals campaign and those kinds of things. And it's still going and it's done incredible work. That said, I still think maybe even the public inquiry by the NHL itself might be enough, right? In that it lets people know they're looking into it. But I think it is a time of action, and maybe you just have to just bite the bullet and make a change here.
I hate to use this particular person's names. I know that Steve, for one, will blanch. But there is a famous quote by Sarah Palin about how she could see Russia from her balcony. Right? We all know that that's what she said, except she never said it. And so that's a twist of what she said And if you go back and listen to what she actually said, it was different. Now, that's irrelevant to this conversation, except that, again, Bubba, I'm not arguing. Look, I don't know full detail of why Conn Smythe did or didn't take certain players. And in fact, I don't even dispute the fact that Herb Carnegie was a good enough player by everything I've read and heard that he should have been playing in the NHL. And I can't explain to you, I can't make the case that that's defendable or defensible. I don't know enough about that to explain why. The man should have been playing in the NHL somewhere.
Wasn't playing in the National Hockey League because he was black.
And I don't dispute that. I don't dispute that. My issue with this discussion is that if that's the point we're going to take, let's look at this thing from why did Herb Carnegie not play, and was it entirely because he was black, and who all was then responsible for that? We can have that discussion. The reason I'm a little hesitant right now is because every single person that I've heard write or speak about why the Conn Smythe Trophy should be renamed goes to that quote. And that quote is the reason why people are saying it should be renamed. And based on a quote that even the people who've written about it in research say he may never have said, if that's the sole purpose, you can't do it. If there's something else that you can find that shows that he deserves to have his name taken off, that's a discussion I'm absolutely willing to have.
Well, I think if we're looking at him being prevented from being in the NHL, part of it is, I mean, there wasn't a territorial exemption then, but he was playing in the Gardens in 1938 for the Young Rangers as a junior. He was there. He was available to Toronto before finally. I mean, the Rangers probably had a C card on him at one point too, and did offer him. And it wasn't so much the money. It was the fact that, and this he did talk about. He never talked to us 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds about any of this stuff. It was all about being better men. It was all boys in those times, unfortunately, for hockey. But when I saw him again, and I don't know when that was, 2010 or 2009 or something like this, he did mention, he never mentioned Smythe, ever, not once. But he did mention, obviously, that the racism to him was systemic. And I guess what we're looking at here is a representative of that system. And part of that is the tearing down. When you look at the Confederation's generals, the Confederate generals, their statues being torn down. I mean, many of them were slave owners, but more it was for what they stood for. In that case, we have to look at some other people from that era. We really do. And I'm not against the NHL sort of cleaning house in that sense. I mean, what does it mean to say we're against it? What does it mean to say, and Randy Ambrosi said that about the CFL. He said, look, we have not been innocent here in the past. We've had some great things when it comes to race relations in our past, but we have been guilty of something. I'm not sure the NHL has ever said that. If they have, then if you don't have actions to go with it. But again, I don't know that you want to. This is a real tough one because of the evidentiary situation that we're talking here. It's never been proof that he necessarily didn't say it, but you shouldn't have to prove a negative, right? So,
well, to me, again, the
I'm a bit waffly here, Bubba. I realize that.
You have a man of power, right? And let's be, because Conn Smythe had the ability and the power to make a difference, and he clearly didn't. And even if he didn't use the exact, like, how can a quote like that, even if it was not crafted in those exact words, we're talking. This is now 2020, right? And those words were apparently said in 1938. I mean, we're looking at almost 100 years of words or some type of implication lasting the entire length of a man that lived well into his 90s. And you know what? Maybe Herb Carnegie was a classy fella. I mean, there are quotes that you can see where Herb Carnegie actually said how much he was hurt by things that were said about, in terms of racist actions. And maybe I thought I'd read a quote of that he was hurt by Conn Smythe. And he was disappointed in the fact that I think he was 19, 20 years old, that he didn't take a chance on him. So again, there's just not a lot of documentation for almost for millions of things, including world wars back in the late 1930s. But again, to me, actions speak louder than words. The guy was too good of a hockey player to be denied by this league. and some of the most important people. And I'll throw in Lester Patrick as well too. He's part of this as well, right?
That's what I'm saying. The whole era. Why aren't we looking at all the trophies? Norris, Patrick, all these guys.
You know,
and maybe it's just time to change all the names.
You're talking about one of the most honorable achievements in the sport of the National Hockey League, and winning that playoff MVP trophy. To me, that should be emblematic of someone of high character, maybe an outstanding player or not. It's strange because Conn Smythe, I don't believe he played the game, did he? And it seems like most of the most important trophies in National Hockey League are named after players. And that's a bizarre thing for some reason. But I mean, that trophy is emblematic of excellence. And to me, even the fact that we're having this discussion about Conn Smythe, whether he did or did not, puts this all into question, in my opinion. That trophy should be renamed, whether it be Herb Carnegie or Willie O'Ree or whatever. Maybe we should, again, open the discussion on, should that trophy be named after this person?
Well, listen, if it's systemic, it wasn't a very big system, right? I mean, from 43 on, it was six owners from 43 on, right? 1943 on, and from 38, when this quote allegedly was made, there were probably 9, right? So take a look at that, and that's why I'm saying maybe we need to rename all of the trophies if it's systemic, for the people who perpetrated that system. And maybe you don't have, that might be sort of the answer here.
What do you think? Should the Conn Smythe Trophy be renamed? Should all the trophies be re-examined? Do we know what Lord Stanley of Preston's views on race were? Could we go that far if we find something?
Good point.
Is the answer. Our Twitter handles are on the screen. You can be in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you again soon.